It's January 31st, 1989. We are in Huntington Beach, California, a very desirable suburban city in the LA basin. Franklin UN is just coming home from his business. He's coming home from a hard day, long day at work.
Daddy!
Hey, sweetie, hold on. Let me put these boxes down.
He has a wife and 2 daughters who adore him.
Here, be careful.
And now I'm gonna grab the briefcase with the car.
He returns out to the garage. The family hears a very loud noise.
What is going on in here? Dad! Oh my God, Franklin! Dad!
Her husband and father staggers back into the room covered in blood and collapses halfway into the kitchen, and half his body is still in the garage doorway.
Mom, go call someone!
The wife goes absolutely out of her mind and calls 911 and reports this as an accident.
My husband, he's not responding. Please, just hurry.
The first officer that arrives takes a look at this guy and realizes this is no accident.
Dispatch, I'm gonna have 1 male deceased. Go ahead and start me a medical examiner.
Huntington Beach is not a place where you'd expect to encounter violent crime, but crime knows no bounds, and violence knows no address.
I'm a retired homicide detective. I retired after 30 years of service. As far as I was concerned, being assigned to homicide was the best job in the business. It was a Tuesday, and it was a regular work day for me.
Oh, babe, I think I'm gonna turn on in.
I worked a shift during the day.
The phone rings, and he instinctively knows who it is.
Mason.
It's not a friend. It's work.
Where?
You can feel it when they call.
It would always be someone that outranked you.
I'm on my way.
And it would always be a situation where you had to go from 0 to 60 immediately.
Looks like I gotta go to work.
When those calls come in, there's a certain urgency by the caller, and you're supposed to immediately go there, bail out of an aircraft at low altitude, and somehow resolve this before you hit the ground.
No one detective solves a homicide. It's a team effort. You have to draw on all the experience of anyone that's willing to help you.
Is Detective Hooper here yet?
Yeah, he's over in the garage.
When Mason arrives at the residence where this occurred, he's shown into the crime scene by a uniformed officer who points out the victim.
I recall that the victim was on the floor of the kitchen. He had what appeared to be a single gunshot wound to the chest.
So what do we know so far?
Married, couple kids. Wife said he just got home from work.
He's a pharmacist by trade. He owns several drugstores in Carson, California, more of a working class, tough kind of neighborhood. But he lives in Huntington Beach and travels back and forth to work. One of the detectives assigned to the case by Mason is Detective Richard Hooper.
I think I got something.
Hooper has discovered the briefcase. Mason gets down on one knee and looks in this briefcase, and it's filled with cash. Now, that's interesting.
How much do you think's in there?
I don't know.
I was informed sometime later that there was $30,000 in cash in the briefcase.
Now, why is a pharmacist traveling around with 30 grand in his briefcase? He is a pharmacist, which means he can buy Schedule I narcotics. The question becomes, what is your work, Franklin? And what are you doing with this much cash? The other question is, why is it still there? Why not take the money? Well, the answer is they either don't know about the money or they panic after they shoot him.
You need evidence?
I have no idea who the suspect could be. It could be a neighbor, it could be the wife. It's a mistake to focus too soon on a particular suspect. So then you get tunnel vision and you start looking for evidence that tends to incriminate someone rather than just trying to find the truth.
Anything else interesting?
Not really. Haven't found any casings.
The fact that there are no shell casings told me the weapon used was a revolver.
Most people in 1989 had revolvers, where the casing is retained in the cylinder after the round has been fired.
I had a great opportunity to work with Detective Dale Mason. He is one of the best detectives dealing with homicide cases that I ever met in Orange County. Detective Mason will generally just eyeball the crime scene. After he accumulates enough information, he will start talking with individuals
Meet you back at the station.
that were actually at the crime scene.
First off, I want to tell you I'm sorry for your loss.
And Mason is careful when he approaches her. He doesn't want to alarm her or make her believe that somehow he is suspicious of her or even suspicious of her husband. He opens up with the standard line of questioning. So tell me about Franklin.
He's 43 years old. He's originally from China.
The victim had immigrated from China. He owned and operated at least 2 pharmacies in Los Angeles.
Of course, the 70s were really pivotal years, and during that time, we had a lot of immigration from Southeast Asia, for instance. A lot of those people came to California.
And he really liked Los Angeles, but we've just always been more comfortable living in Huntington Beach.
It was not unusual at all for families to live like in the suburban communities of Orange County and work in downtown Los Angeles.
She says he worked in a bad neighborhood filled with other immigrants, and they all loved him because they saw him as a brother, that he too was an immigrant to the United States, just like them.
He was a very kind individual that really wanted to help his community.
This crime, when it happened, must have been an absolute shock to the community because it would have been so unusual. He had a pharmacy up in the Carson area, and he was an important person in that community.
They weren't customers, they were his friends. Mr. Ewan allowed them to come to his location with a check, and he would cash it.
And it finally strikes Mason. It's the 31st of January. It's the end of the month. People get paid by the end of the month. He has that much money because he is prepared to cash people's checks.
He had a ton of cash on him all the time. That's when I convinced him to hire security guards.
He hired licensed security guards, but he didn't go through an agency. If you were licensed and matched a certain image and could be intimidating, I think he would hire you.
So he therefore would use them to protect him when he had that kind of money. When he would drive home, they were instructed to follow him to a certain exit. Then he would get off at that exit off the freeway and proceed to his house a short distance away, but they weren't permitted to follow him, so even they would know where he lived.
Victim didn't trust the security guards 100%.
So that gives Mason something to go on. Who are these people, and do they connect to this crime in some way?
I thank you for coming in.
Because he believes Mrs. Yuen is not part of this.
I was assigned a homicide case, the moment I got the phone call, I made up my mind right then and there. I was going to do everything legally possible to solve that murder.
Homicide investigation is not a sprint, it's a marathon. But the day continues, and it just continues as long as it needs to.
At 9:30 in the morning, I'm at the autopsy.
What do you have for me?
Pathologist ruled that it was a homicide and the cause of death was a gunshot wound to the heart.
Looks like a 38 or a 357 Magnum.
This is a close contact gunshot wound because of stippling and tattooing. It's a phrase applied by medical examiners to describe burning and discoloration of the skin at the point of entry of a gunshot wound. The burning and the discoloration and bruising of the skin is a result of gas, flame, and unburned particles of powder exiting the muzzle of a gun when a bullet is fired. So someone is very close. The bullet size in those two are the same. The difference is the amount of propulsion.
Now that we had the bullet, if and when we found the murder weapon, we could do a comparison.
You mind if I use your phone?
There's certain characteristics of the bullet as it comes out of the gun that creates a unique look.
Mason tells Hooper to meet him over at Ewan's pharmacy to see what they can learn from his employees.
Okay.
I started to form the opinion early on, one, that the suspect was someone that had inside information.
We'd like to ask you a few questions about your boss.
I thought there was a high probability that one of the security guards was involved.
My name's Lester Hicks.
Lester Hicks is the security guard assigned to protect Franklin Yuen.
The guy you need to talk to is Danny Mosley.
He was very cooperative.
It's kind of his right-hand man the past few months.
Do you know where Mr. Mosley is right now?
No idea.
Lester says he just kind of disappeared. He didn't show up for work one day and nobody's seen him since.
That dude was wild.
How so?
He talked about how you should rip Mr. Yuen off because he had all his money and
He said
stuff.
that this security guard had a plan to rob the victim.
Now, Mason's eyes and ears perk up when he hears that. Here's a guy, Lester Hicks, saying out loud that Danny Mosley, the long-term security guard, has mentioned robbing Franklin Yuen. No, that's interesting.
All right, Mr. Hicks, thanks.
Well, Mr. Mosley, why did you disappear? Putting your final touches on the plan to rob and kill Mr. Yuen? I think we better find out. Detective Mason's first step in trying to find Mosley is to run him through their systems.
I'm looking for some information on a Danny Mosley.
Well, that hits pay dirt almost immediately. Danny Mosley's in jail. So he's going to be awfully easy to locate. He's in a federal lockup facility in Los Angeles. Mason contacts the field office of the FBI. So what's up with Danny Mosley? And they explain that Danny Mosley is the leader of a stick-up crew. They are ambitious, they are busy, and they are dangerous.
About the date?
Mosley had been arrested for committing several robberies. We were able to confirm that Mosley was in custody on the night of the murder.
So now Mosley has a great alibi, but that doesn't mean he doesn't have a Confederate who robbed Yuen on his behalf.
See, I don't think he's gonna talk.
The FBI says Mosley's hardcore, and he won't talk to him, period, the end.
He's a real tough guy.
Mason says, yeah, I figured that, but I want to plant a seed with him and see if it grows.
I was hoping that we could shake Mosley up, make him nervous, and maybe get him to communicate with someone about any knowledge that he might have concerning the murder of our victim.
Who the hell are you? I ain't got nothing to say to you.
That's okay, Danny, because I just need you to listen.
Dale Mason is just very straightforward. You don't see him laughing and being jovial. He's just got this straight line approach, but it's very, very effective.
We told him that we knew that he was involved in the murder of our victim, and that sooner or later we'd be back to pick him up.
Guard!
Mason is aware that criminals are very evasive, easily frightened, and if you convince them that you know something, they're going to panic. So Mason waits. He knows it will happen because Mosley's got nothing else to do. He's in jail. Nothing to occupy his time except his own fear. It takes 2 weeks in Mosley's case. Two weeks before he calls anybody.
Hey, Mosley, what's happening?
Their calls are recorded. They are told that. So criminals believe, because they're smart guys, that they'll just speak in code and their friends will know what they mean.
Yo, I need you to do something for me.
And they're correct. Their friends know what it means. And so do the police, for heaven's sake.
Yo, I need you to do something for me.
My partner and I listened to all the telephone calls that were being made where Mosley was being housed.
I need you to get rid of my baby. You understand?
All right, I got you.
Mosley is talking to another male subject, and he's asking him to get rid of something.
Get rid of my baby.
But he's referring to this something as his baby.
All right, yeah.
All right.
Well, you don't get rid of babies, but you do get rid of objects.
It was obviously something he was trying to either destroy or conceal in some manner.
Now, what object could that be?
My guess, that's our weapon.
All they have is a phone number. They have no idea who Mosley was speaking with. They have a number that the person was called at.
I wonder if he ever visited Mosley in jail.
With visitation procedures, the person visiting has to document his or her name, an address, and telephone number. When the call is made from the dormitory, the number being called is also documented.
Enjoy it.
I think I got something here. Gerald Jennings.
So he goes to the logs, and there's the name and address of the guy he called.
That's cool.
He runs a background on this kid, and he's not what he thinks he should be.
He was a young man. He was a student at UCLA. He didn't have a criminal record. He'd never been arrested or anything like that. We obtained a search warrant. Once we were in place, I telephoned this individual and told him that I had been in the detention center with Mosley as a fellow inmate.
Oh, hey, man. It's Danny's friend again.
And that Mosley had asked me to contact him
I'm about to head your way.
to pick up his gun. I wasn't sure what he was going to do. I was hoping he would get the gun and leave the residence.
Mason's ploy works. Jennings panics when he gets that phone call and immediately leaves the house. And he's carrying something when he gets in the car.
Suspects on the move.
Put your hands where I can see them. Do it now. Step out slowly. Keep your hands where I can see them.
We stopped him,
Gerald Jennings, we have a search warrant for your car.
executed the search warrant.
You got him?
Got him.
And we found the .357 Magnum in the car.
Mason is somewhat elated. Now he has a gun of the proper caliber in the hands of a known Confederate to Mosley. Is it the murder weapon? And is Jennings the killer? Well, we're going to have to see. Detective Dale Mason is on the hunt for the murderer of Franklin Ewan, a pharmacist with a young family from Huntington Beach, California. Mason takes Jennings to his headquarters and locks him in an interrogation room and personally carries the gun to ballistics for examination. So now he's proceeding quickly to answer both questions. Is it the gun and is it the guy?
I was very hopeful that we had recovered the gun that was used in the murder, but I needed ballistics experts to confirm that for me.
Y'all mind telling me what's going on?
Jennings initially wants to play bad guy.
I mean, you have no right to kick me.
He's saying all the bad guy things, but he doesn't mean it.
Well, you know you're not here for nothing.
He had a kind of a smug attitude, as though he was above it all.
We're investigating a murder.
Mason sees through the bravado to cover the fear.
I told him we were investigating the murder, and that as far as I knew, the weapon that was taken out of his car was the weapon that was used in the murder.
If you don't cooperate, we're gonna bring you down for murder.
When I told him that I thought that he had possession of a gun that was used in the murder, that got his attention.
And now Jennings looks like he's going to have a coronary.
I'll be back.
And Mason gets up and leaves. He just wanders down to ballistics to see the good news.
Oh, hey. Bad news, I'm afraid.
You're kidding.
It's not your gun.
And it's not good news.
Are you absolutely sure?
Positive.
The gun didn't match. That just, in my mind, didn't diminish the odds that we would ever recover the weapon.
Homicide is always a series of problems. So now we got to go back to Jennings in the hope that maybe he can clear this up in some way. Jennings is frantic. He begins to just literally start running his mouth.
So how do you know Mosley? I've known him since we were kids.
He and Mosley grew up in the same neighborhood.
When he called me from jail.
He tells Mason that he worked at not being a criminal, but he maintained a certain loyalty and friendship with Mosley.
I didn't shoot anybody. That gun never left my house.
And he's almost to the point of tears. And Mason sees a certain amount of honesty in that he's probably truthful, that he just kept it for Mosley.
I got nothing to do with this.
If you didn't use it to kill anyone, who did?
He was trying to tell us everything that he knew about the members of the robbery crew.
Danny ran with a bunch of guys. They didn't do just banks.
He told us that he was aware that the crew had robbed the Queen Mary and the credit union at the Long Beach Naval Shipyard.
Mosley told Jennings all about running this robbery crew and bragged to him about the crimes. Mosley trusted him as a lifelong friend. So then Cooper hits this kid with a $64 question.
This crew, this Mosley crew.
Got a name? Give us something. There's this one guy.
He knew the names of some of the crew members.
Michael.
He told us about one In particular,
he had an Italian last name.
The subject had recently left California and returned to Cleveland, Ohio.
Benicio. Michael Benicio.
He said his name is Michael Benicio. He was part of that crew. He was in all the robberies.
See? Now that wasn't so hard, was it?
Can I go now?
Yes. Yes, you can.
I felt in my gut that we were headed in the right direction.
Mason is doing what all homicide detectives do. One foot in front of the other, one crumb to the next crumb. Where is that going to lead him? Mason knows it will lead me wherever it must.
I got a name I want to run by you. Michael Benicio? Is he in jail right now?
We learned that Michael, since returning to Cleveland, had been arrested for robbery.
Oh, he's out.
Benicio makes bond, but he's bonded by his parents who put up their house to get him out of jail. So he knows if he bails or runs, the parents lose their home. He's not going to do that. So he's going to stay in Cleveland, and they know where.
Thanks. I appreciate it.
I thought it was critical to get to Cleveland as soon as possible. Sometimes timing is everything. We needed to get to Michael while the door was open, while the opportunity was there.
Mason won't back off. He'll go to Cleveland. He'll go to Mars if he has to. It's time to confront Michael and find out what he knows. Mason and Hooper contact Benicio's attorney to see if he's willing to talk to them.
Now, this meeting is all contingent on my client.
To their surprise, Benicio's lawyer is very interested in cooperating.
We met Michael at his attorney's office, and we learned that Michael was in Cleveland at the time of the murder. That was as good of an alibi as you can get. But I believe at the time that Michael wasn't directly involved in the murder of the victim.
Why don't you tell us about the crews you were running with in California?
Because Michael's looking at a significant sentence for robbery. He was hoping by helping us that he would get a reduced sentence.
Then I went back to Cleveland.
Michael was very personable, likable. He told us about being involved in this robbery crew.
We made a lot of money.
He says these guys are marching right along, making a lot of money, and Mosley's the brains.
Then he got arrested.
When Mosley gets arrested, the crew falls apart. They don't have a leader.
We were hoping you could shed some light on a murder that happened back in Huntington Beach.
I told Michael,
we think a 357 was involved.
We believe that a 357 Magnum was involved.
I had a gun like that.
Michael volunteered to me that he had owned the 357 Magnum when he was participating in this robbery crew in Southern California.
I gave it to a guy.
Benicio tells them he didn't want to travel across state lines with that gun, so he gave it to a Confederate, a guy who was also a member of the stick-up crew, whose name was Willie Linton Hall. Mr. Hall told Benicio he would keep his gun for him until he returned from visiting his parents.
Willie's a bit crazy, you know?
Michael told me that Hall was the kind of person that can actually commit the murder.
Benicio says Hall probably did that murder because he's crazy enough to do that. And Mosley had talked to him about this pharmacist that always had a lot of money.
What makes you so sure Willie Hall's the guy?
One word. Money.
He goes on to say that Hall is probably worried, now that the crew has broken up, that his income is going away. So Hall probably struck out on his own using the gun provided to him by Mr. Benicio.
I can call him if you want.
Not yet.
At this point, I'm starting to feel that we're at a very critical junction in this investigation. The next few steps I make better be the right ones.
Dale Mason is a person that knows what he's doing. He has a plan. He's very methodical, very calculating, and thorough.
Superiors criticize me for being slow. Their criticism was of absolutely no importance to me. I was going to work the case my way.
Mason doesn't care about pleasing his bosses. All he wants is justice. Mason and his partner make their next move.
We developed a plan to have Michael released into our custody.
Mason and Hooper are putting themselves on the line with this because they're obligating themselves to a judge in Ohio that Mr. Benicio is not going to escape and that they will return him to Ohio when required.
We had the FBI, we had Michael's attorney, we had the local district attorney. Well, they were all on the same page. And so the judge was very cooperative.
So off they go to California. The plan is for Benicio to call Hall and invite him out to lunch.
Hey, Willie, it's Benicio.
We wanted him to drive to a location that would take a considerable amount of time to get there so that he and Hall would have an opportunity to talk.
Detective Mason's a smart guy. He understands you don't just bring up a subject of a murder in 6 blocks. He tells him, pick a place that's several miles away so you have ample time to get around to Mr. UN.
Okay, I'll pick you up around noon.
So Benicio makes the call.
Don't forget the gun, huh?
Mr. Hall agrees to go all the way across town with Benicio to go have lunch.
We wired the car for sound and recording. We set up a major surveillance team. We had a lot of risk involved.
If something goes wrong, Hall could kill him right then and there. He's got a gun with him. It's Benicio's gun, but so what? It's still a gun.
Want to run through it one last time?
There is some preparation involved here.
The main thing is,
Detective Mason, in general, would talk to the individual about the parameters of how you can talk to him, what you could say and what you can't say or do.
Ready to do this?
And that it would be legal and upheld in a court of law.
Now, when Mason sets up this plan, does he know that Hall is the one, as Hall is the shooter? Maybe. The only guy that knows is Hall. And you're relying on a fellow criminal, Benicio, to elicit that information. It's another step by step, and Hall happens to be the next step. So off they go, and Benicio goes to Hall's apartment and picks him up. So they're in the car, Benicio and Hall.
Where the hell you been at?
Reliving old times.
Remember the run at the Navy Yard? We almost hit them cops on the way out.
has two buddies who also happen to be bandits.
Yeah, that one was close.
Benicio finally looks at Hall and says,
What happened to that guy? You know, the pharmacist?
hey, whatever happened to that, that pharmacist dude? The one that had all of the money. That mostly was his guard for a while.
Did you end up robbing him?
I tried to rob the dude. Dude wouldn't give me the briefcase. So, I blasted him.
And he says, yeah, I tried to rob him, but he wouldn't give me the briefcase, so I blasted the.
Oh, my. Guess what? No more investigation. Now it's laser focus on Willie Linton Hall.
Did you end up robbing him?
So after this light conversation between bandits, Hall looked at him and smiled and said, I blasted that.
I blasted him.
So now Mr. Hall has just confessed to a murder on tape in front of a witness.
Hall goes into some detail. He talks about surveilling him.
I was watching him.
He tells Benicio his income is falling apart. There is no more work without Danny Mosley. So now what? And Hall remembers the pharmacist.
I knew he had the money, and I needed it.
Hall had the license plate number of the victim's car. He knew a police dispatcher.
Hey, girl.
So he went to her and told her a sob story about being the victim of a hit and run.
Yeah, I got the dude's license plate number.
He says he just wants to see this guy and settle it like men between he and this person and get his car fixed.
It's 4V.
Can she run a license plate for him
056.
and give him the guy's address? And this woman agrees to it, believing his story, apparently. She provides him with registration information and the address of Franklin UN.
Hey, thank you.
I felt sorry for the dispatcher.
I'll talk to you later, all right?
She was a young woman, and she was fairly new on the job, and I felt like Hall had just taken advantage of her, and as a result, she ended up getting arrested and losing her job. When Hall's talking to Michael, it's like fun and games. He's jovial.
Oh, man.
Hall is proud of himself that he's so clever with this plan.
Yeah, that was good.
Detective Mason and Detective Hooper are listening to it in progress as it moves along. They're going to wait until they get every word they can out of this story before they stop that car. Hall tells Benicio that the night of the shooting, he drives to that house and finds no place to hide. So he decides that he has to climb a tree, which is almost something out of a cartoon, but that's what he does. And he waits for UN to come home. UN comes in the driveway, pulls into the garage. Hall drops out of the tree and goes into the garage to confront him.
Daddy, Daddy!
Hey, sweetie, hold on. Let me put these boxes down.
Hall says that he confronted him in the garage,
What are you doing? Briefcase, hand it over.
demanded the briefcase.
When he confronts him,
Briefcase, I want it. Hand it over.
What do you want? Give
it to me.
Get out of my house.
something goes wrong. But Hall says, I panicked and I shot him.
God damn it.
What is going on in here?
Then I heard people inside, and I just ran. A typical armed robbery scenario. When panic happens, the gunfire tends to begin.
Dad!
Franklin!
Wake up! Mom, go call someone!
Did you get the money?
Nah, it just took off.
He kills him for nothing. He panics, he pulls the trigger, he ends Franklin Yuen's life, and he derives $0 and 0 cents.
LAPD, keep your hands where we can see them. See your hands.
We called in LAPD, had them stop the car. We took Michael and Willie Hall into custody. That's the best feeling in the world. We just made our case. We got a suspect in custody.
Mr. Benicio is granted his deal and winds up doing 10 years in prison in Ohio. Mr. Hall is taken to trial for first-degree murder and given the overwhelming evidence in the case. The jury has no difficulty finding him guilty.
When you hear the defendant basically admitting why he did it, that's compelling. I think that went a large way towards the jury finding Willie Hall guilty. This is an aggravating crime because it's one where Mr. Hall had a gun going into the crime, trying to take money from an innocent individual at his home. And when the attempt to get the money was unsuccessful, in a way, gratuitously shot and killed Mr. Yuen. So this is a pretty aggravating crime of murder while in the commission of a robbery. And this certainly is an aggravating factor because of the callousness of the crime itself.
Once he was convicted, once he was in prison, that definitely was a day that people in the community were happy that he was no longer going to be able to terrorize anyone.
Franklin Yuen remains in the grave. What was his crime? He didn't have one. He was an innocent victim living his life in the best way he thought he could, to take care of himself and his family.
It's a terrible thing for young kids to see or witness the death of one of their parents. I can't imagine they'll ever recover from that.
I would just extend my admiration and respect for the strength that they've carried out in living their life after losing their father.
One of the things I'm the most proud of is the Huntington Beach Police Department. A crime of this kind of magnitude, police would not stop until they solved it. They don't give up.
There are nights that disappear into history without leaving a trace. And then there are nights that refuse to end, nights that linger long after the sun rises, carried in the memories of those who witnessed their aftermath. On the morning of July 23, 2007, the quiet town of Cheshire, Connecticut, woke expecting another ordinary summer day. The streets looked exactly as they had the evening before. Front lawns were neatly trimmed. Flags moved gently in the warm July breeze. Neighbors prepared for work while children, still enjoying summer vacation, slept peacefully behind bedroom windows. Nothing about the town suggested that history was about to remember its name for one of the darkest reasons imaginable. Cheshire was the kind of place people pointed to when they talked about the American dream. Tree-lined roads stretched between comfortable family homes. Schools stood at the center of community life. Local businesses knew their regular customers by name. People smiled at each other in grocery store aisles. Doors were sometimes left unlocked. Parents believed their children were growing up somewhere safe. Safety was never guaranteed. It was simply assumed. Sometimes the greatest tragedies are not born in places already consumed by violence. Sometimes they arrive quietly, slipping into neighborhoods where everyone believes tomorrow will look exactly like yesterday. That assumption would be shattered before the day was over. Long before investigators sealed off a neighborhood. Long before television helicopters circled overhead. Long before reporters stood outside yellow police tape asking how something so unimaginable could happen in a town like this. There was simply a family spending what they believed was another ordinary summer weekend. There was a husband who had devoted his life to medicine. There was a wife whose kindness had quietly shaped countless lives around her. There were two daughters standing on the edge of exciting futures, each carrying dreams unique to their age. They did not know they were living through the final ordinary hours of their lives together. Across town, two men were moving through lives marked by addiction, repeated criminal behavior, and years of destructive choices. Neither path had been inevitable. Both had become increasingly difficult to escape. At some point, those separate worlds crossed. Not because of revenge. Not because of a personal conflict. Not because the family had done anything wrong. But because chance, opportunity, and a series of terrible decisions intersected in a way that would leave permanent scars on an entire community. Years later, investigators would examine every minute. Lawyers would analyze every decision. Psychologists would debate motivation. Police officials would defend tactics while critics questioned whether different choices might have changed the outcome. The courts would eventually determine criminal responsibility. Yet one question has never completely disappeared. Could this tragedy have unfolded differently? It is a question that still echoes through documentaries, legal discussions, and conversations among those who remember that summer. Because this story is not only about crime. It is about timing. It is about trust. It is about how ordinary routines can suddenly become extraordinary turning points. Every familiar object inside an ordinary home would eventually become part of an investigation. A staircase. A hallway. Family photographs. Kitchen counters. Personal belongings that, only hours earlier, had represented nothing more than another peaceful Sunday evening. When investigators later entered the property, they were not simply documenting evidence. They were walking through the remains of interrupted lives. But before there was an investigation, before forensic teams photographed rooms, before prosecutors assembled evidence, before juries listened to weeks of testimony, there was silence. The quiet kind that belongs only to suburban neighborhoods after midnight. Streetlights cast pale circles across empty roads. Crickets filled the darkness with sounds so ordinary that no one noticed them. Most families slept peacefully, confident that tomorrow would begin with breakfast, errands, and plans for another summer week. No one imagined that one home had already become the center of a crisis unfolding behind closed doors. For the people living nearby, the night remained completely ordinary. That may be one of the most unsettling truths in this case. History rarely announces itself while it is happening. It waits until afterward. Only then do people remember where they were. Only then do they recall what they heard on the morning news. Only then do they realize that a familiar town has become known across an entire nation. As dawn approached, emergency calls would begin setting events into motion. Dispatchers would relay information that seemed incomplete. Officers would race toward an address without knowing the full picture waiting for them. Every passing minute would matter. Every decision would later be examined. Every action would become part of an investigation reaching far beyond a single neighborhood. In the years that followed, the Cheshire home invasion would be discussed in courtrooms, police academies, universities, and criminal justice classrooms across the United States. Not only because of the crimes themselves, But because the case forced difficult conversations about hostage response, emergency communication, investigative procedure, criminal behavior, trauma, and the fragile balance between caution and intervention, the story became larger than a single criminal case. It became a case study, a cautionary lesson, a painful reminder that public confidence in safety can disappear in a single morning. Yet amid every legal argument and every headline, there is something that should never be forgotten. Statistics cannot tell us who people were. Court records cannot describe the warmth of family conversations. Evidence logs cannot measure love. Trials determine guilt. They cannot restore what was lost. Before this story becomes one of investigations, evidence, courtroom testimony, and national attention, it must first remain what it truly is. The story of a family. A family whose ordinary life reflected thousands of others across America. A family that believed they would wake together the next morning. A family whose names would soon become known to millions of strangers. This is not merely the story of a crime. It is the story of how an ordinary summer night became one of the most haunting criminal cases in modern American history, leaving behind questions that continue to challenge investigators, legal scholars, law enforcement professionals, and anyone who has ever believed that home is the one place where fear cannot enter. Morning has a way of making every place look honest. As the first light slowly settled over Cheshire, Connecticut, nothing about the landscape hinted that the town was quietly stepping into a day that would forever divide its history into two chapters, before and after. The roads remained calm. The trees stood almost motionless beneath the warm air of late July. Sprinklers clicked rhythmically across carefully maintained front lawns, sending tiny arcs of water into the morning sunlight. Delivery trucks followed familiar routes. Coffee brewed in kitchens across the neighborhood. Radios came alive with weather reports, traffic updates, and ordinary conversations that belonged to another ordinary Monday. Life continued exactly as it always had. For everyone except one family. What makes this case so difficult to understand is not only what happened. It is where it happened. When people imagine violent crime, they often picture places already carrying a reputation for danger. They imagine neighborhoods marked by neglect, abandoned buildings, flashing police lights, or streets where fear has slowly become routine. Cheshire was none of those places. It was a community built around predictability. Families planted roots there because they believed stability could be found. Parents watched little league games together. School events filled community calendars. Local businesses sponsored youth programs. Teachers recognized generations of students from the same families. The town represented something many Americans quietly search for throughout their lives, the feeling that home exists somewhere beyond constant uncertainty. No place can ever promise complete safety. But some places become symbols of it. For decades, Cheshire had earned that reputation. That is why the events of July 23, 2007, echoed far beyond Connecticut. People across the country looked at the headlines and asked themselves an uncomfortable question. If something like this could happen there, could it happen anywhere? Fear spreads quickly when it reaches places once considered immune. Investigators would later reconstruct timelines with remarkable precision. Surveillance footage, phone records, witness interviews, bank transactions, emergency dispatch logs. Every minute would eventually be documented. Every movement carefully mapped. Yet no investigation, regardless of its detail, can fully recreate what certainty feels like before it disappears. Only the people living those ordinary hours experienced that version of reality. A family preparing for another week. Neighbors carrying groceries inside. Children thinking about summer vacations. Friends making plans they assumed they would keep. That innocence can only exist before people know the ending. Looking backward always creates the illusion that warning signs were obvious. Reality is rarely that simple. Human beings naturally search for explanations after tragedy. We replay events. We ask what someone should have noticed. What decision should have changed? Which conversation should have happened differently? Those questions comfort us because they suggest disasters are preventable if only enough attention is paid. Sometimes they are. Sometimes they are not. In this case, investigators, journalists, attorneys, psychologists, and law enforcement officials would spend years examining decisions measured in minutes. Each conclusion depended upon information that only became available afterward. Hindsight creates clarity. Real time does not. While legal proceedings eventually established responsibility for the crimes, public discussion expanded into something much larger. Emergency response. Hostage negotiation. Risk assessment. Police command structure. Communication failures. Training standards. Every one of those subjects became part of a national conversation because of what unfolded inside a single home. But before any institution entered the story, before experts debated tactics or legal standards, there was simply a family whose lives reflected the quiet routines shared by countless households across America. Photographs taken before 2007 reveal smiles that seem almost timeless. Vacation pictures. School celebrations. Birthdays. Family gatherings. Nothing extraordinary. And perhaps that is exactly what makes them so powerful. Extraordinary families often appear perfectly ordinary until history unexpectedly remembers them. The Petit family had built their lives through years of commitment, education, hard work, and community involvement. Neighbors described them as approachable. Friends remembered generosity that rarely called attention to itself. Their lives were not defined by public recognition. They were defined by consistency. Consistency is invisible while it exists. Only after it disappears do people understand its value. The family's home reflected that same sense of permanence. It was not a mansion intended to impress strangers. It was a home built for everyday life. Rooms carried memories accumulated over years rather than months. Hallways connected ordinary routines. Bedrooms reflected changing personalities as children grew older. Every object inside represented choices made over time. Books collected. Furniture arranged. Photographs displayed. Holiday decorations stored away for another season. Homes become archives without anyone realizing it. Each room quietly records years that pass almost unnoticed. Birthdays celebrated. Homework completed. Meals shared. Conversations remembered only by those present. Then, in a single night, those familiar spaces became something entirely different. Not because the walls changed, but because memory did. After tragedy, people often say they can never look at a place the same way again. The location becomes permanently divided between what it once represented and what later occurred there. That transformation is invisible. Yet it changes everything. One of the lasting lessons from this case is how ordinary environments can suddenly become central to national attention. A residential street became recognizable to millions. Television crews filled sidewalks where children had once ridden bicycles. Satellite trucks replaced family cars. Reporters spoke in hushed voices while neighbors watched from behind windows, struggling to understand how familiar surroundings had become symbols of unimaginable loss. Communities experience trauma differently than individuals. Individuals grieve people. Communities grieve certainty. Both losses are real. Both leave lasting marks. For the residents of Cheshire, recovery involved more than mourning. It required rebuilding confidence in routines that had once felt automatic. Parents thought differently about locked doors. Neighborhood watch meetings attracted new interest. Conversations about personal safety became more frequent. Children asked questions adults struggled to answer. The town itself remained physically unchanged. Its emotional landscape did not. Cases like this often become reduced to headlines, verdicts, and sentencing dates. But those milestones tell only part of the story. Behind every courtroom proceeding exists an invisible timeline made up of birthdays that arrived without loved ones. Graduations attended with empty seats. Anniversaries remembered through silence. Ordinary moments suddenly carrying extraordinary absence. Justice can establish accountability. It cannot restore interrupted futures. Perhaps that is why this case continues to resonate. Not because of sensational details, but because it reminds people how fragile ordinary life truly is. Every familiar routine depends upon countless assumptions. That loved ones will return home. That tomorrow will resemble today. That danger belongs somewhere else. Most days those assumptions prove correct. Occasionally, history reminds us they are still assumptions. As investigators eventually pieced together the events leading to that July morning, one reality became increasingly clear. Nothing about the family had made them targets because of personal conflict. They had not invited violence into their lives. They had not knowingly stepped into extraordinary circumstances. Their story intersected with individuals whose choices would alter multiple lives forever. That distinction matters. Victims are sometimes discussed as though their actions somehow explain what happened to them. This case offers no such comfort. The responsibility rested with those who committed the crimes. Understanding criminal behavior does not diminish accountability. If anything, it reinforces it. The investigation would eventually explore backgrounds marked by addiction, repeated offending, unstable lives, and escalating criminal conduct. Experts would debate how those histories developed. Courts would determine legal responsibility. Psychologists would examine personality, impulse control, and decision-making. Those discussions remain important. Yet none of them should overshadow the people whose lives existed long before the investigation began. Because before evidence bags, courtroom exhibits, forensic reports, and legal arguments, there was laughter inside a family home. There were plans for the future. There were conversations no one realized would become final memories. That is where this story truly begins. Not with violence. Not with headlines. But with ordinary lives that deserved the chance to remain ordinary. If someone had driven through Cheshire, Connecticut, in the summer of 2007 with no destination in mind, they might have remembered the town for all the ordinary reasons that rarely make headlines. Wide residential streets wound through neighborhoods shaded by mature maple and oak trees. Front porches overlooked carefully maintained lawns. Local parks filled with families during the long evenings of July, and community events drew familiar faces together year after year. It was the kind of town where people often recognized one another at the grocery store, where school sports and civic organizations connected residents across generations, and where a sense of stability was woven into everyday life. Located between Hartford and New Haven, Cheshire had long been known as a suburban community that balanced residential neighborhoods with small businesses, schools, and public spaces. Many residents commuted to nearby cities for work, returning each evening to quiet streets that felt removed from the pace of urban life. For families raising children, that rhythm was part of the town's appeal. Safety was not viewed as a guarantee, but it was an expectation built over decades of relatively low violent crime and strong community ties. In the years leading up to 2007, conversations about crime in Cheshire rarely dominated local life. Residents were certainly aware that no community was completely immune to criminal activity, yet serious violent offenses remained uncommon enough that they did not define the town's identity. Like many suburban communities across the United States, Cheshire was often described through the language of schools, neighborhoods, volunteer organizations, and family life rather than through public safety concerns. Within that community lived the Petty family. William Petty had established himself as a physician whose professional life centered on caring for patients, while Jennifer Hawk Petty was widely known among friends and neighbors for her involvement with family, education, and community activities. Their daughters, Haley and Michaela, represented two different stages of adolescence, each developing their own interests, friendships, and aspirations. Those who knew the family consistently described them not as public figures, but as active participants in the ordinary routines that shape community life. That ordinary quality is an important part of understanding why the events of July 2007 resonated so deeply across the United States. The case did not capture national attention because the family occupied positions of extraordinary fame or influence. Instead, many people saw aspects of their own lives reflected in the circumstances surrounding them: a suburban neighborhood, summer vacation, familiar routines, and a belief that home was a place of security. When national media organizations began reporting from Cheshire, they frequently emphasized this contrast. Television broadcasts showed tree-lined streets and quiet homes, images that challenged many viewers' assumptions about where serious violent crimes occur. The visual landscape of the town appeared almost unchanged even as investigators worked behind police barriers. That contrast between appearance and reality became one of the defining features of public discussion surrounding the case. For historians and criminologists, the setting also illustrates a broader point about crime and public perception. High-profile cases often reshape how communities understand risk. Before a widely publicized event, residents may think about safety in largely routine ways, locking doors at night, watching out for neighbors, and trusting familiar patterns of daily life. After such an event, those same routines are often viewed through a different lens. Actions that once seemed automatic become conscious decisions, influenced by the awareness that extraordinary events can occur even in places long considered secure. The physical setting of Cheshire did not change overnight. The streets, schools, businesses, and neighborhoods remained where they had always been. What changed was the meaning attached to those places. Residents later described heightened awareness, renewed discussions about personal security, and a greater willingness to participate in neighborhood watch efforts and community preparedness initiatives. Although crime statistics alone could not capture these shifts, they reflected the lasting psychological impact that a single case can have on an entire community. As investigators would later reconstruct the timeline of events, they relied on evidence gathered from multiple locations, including the family home, nearby businesses, surveillance footage, financial records, emergency communications, and witness statements. Each location contributed a different perspective, helping authorities establish a factual sequence based on verifiable information rather than speculation. This careful reconstruction became central to both the criminal investigation and the later court proceedings. Looking back nearly 2 decades later, the Cheshire case remains significant not only because of the crimes themselves, but also because of the questions it raised about emergency response, public safety, criminal justice, and community resilience. Those discussions continue to appear in academic research, law enforcement training, and legal analysis. The setting of the case, a quiet suburban town that many associated with stability, remains inseparable from the broader conversations it inspired. To understand what happened in July 2007, it is therefore necessary to understand the place where it occurred. Cheshire was not simply the backdrop for a criminal investigation. It was a living community whose residents experienced shock, grief, and lasting change. The story that follows is rooted not only in a sequence of criminal acts and legal proceedings, but also in the disruption of everyday life within a town that believed it knew itself well until one summer morning challenged that belief. The setting of a crime is often described through geography: a street, a neighborhood, a town on a map. But places are more than coordinates. They are collections of memories, routines, and relationships. To understand the impact of the Cheshire case, it is necessary to look beyond the physical location and understand the community that existed there before the tragedy changed its identity. In the summer of 2007, Cheshire represented a familiar image of suburban America. It was a place where daily life moved according to predictable patterns. Parents drove children to activities. Students prepared for another school year. Neighbors maintained gardens, attended local events, and exchanged conversations that rarely extended beyond the ordinary concerns of work, family, and community life. The town's identity was closely connected to its people. Like many communities of its size, Cheshire was shaped by countless small interactions that rarely receive attention. A teacher remembering a former student. A neighbor helping someone carry groceries. A local business owner greeting returning customers. These moments do not appear in newspapers, yet they form the foundation of how residents experience belonging. For the Petit family, that community connection was an important part of everyday life. William Petit's career as a physician placed him in a position of trust. Medicine requires more than technical knowledge, It requires patience, empathy, and the ability to provide reassurance during difficult moments. Patients often remember doctors not only for treatments or diagnoses, but for the way they were treated when they were vulnerable. Jennifer Hawkpetty was similarly connected to the lives around her. Friends and community members remembered her involvement in education and family activities. Her role was not defined by public recognition, but by the relationships she built over time. Their daughters, Haley and Michaela, represented the future of the family. Like many teenagers and children, they were growing into their own personalities. They had interests, friendships, and plans that belonged to different stages of life. Haley was approaching adulthood, preparing for the transition that comes with the final years of high school. Michaela was still in childhood, surrounded by the curiosity and energy that define that period. Their lives were not extraordinary because they were famous. They were meaningful because they were ordinary. That distinction became one of the most important themes in the public conversation after the case. When tragedies occur, victims are sometimes reduced to names in headlines or details in legal documents. Over time, however, communities work to restore the fuller picture, the people they were before they became associated with a traumatic event. They were family members, friends, students, professionals, neighbors, people with routines, personalities, and futures that extended far beyond the circumstances that later defined public memory. The community's response reflected this desire to remember individuals rather than only the event. Memorials, charitable efforts, and public discussions focused on preserving the memory of the victims and supporting those affected by the loss. This process of remembrance is common after major tragedies. Communities often face two challenges at the same time: understanding what happened and protecting the humanity of those involved. Investigations require evidence, timelines, and legal categories. Grief requires something different. It requires remembering the person behind the case file. The Cheshire investigation would eventually involve many professionals: law enforcement officers, forensic specialists, prosecutors, defense attorneys, judges, and experts who analyzed different aspects of the case. Each person approached the situation from a different perspective, but all were responding to the same fundamental reality: a community was trying to understand an event that had disrupted its sense of safety. The months and years that followed also revealed how communities adapt after trauma. Public conversations shifted toward emergency preparedness and awareness. Law enforcement agencies reviewed procedures related to crisis response. Legal professionals examined the challenges involved in complex criminal cases. These discussions were not unique to Cheshire. Across the country, communities affected by violent crime often experience similar questions. How should institutions respond? How can future risks be reduced? How can a community recover while continuing to remember those who were lost? There are no simple answers. Recovery after tragedy is rarely a single moment. It happens gradually through conversations, remembrance, changes in policy, and the passage of time. Some wounds become less visible, but important memories remain. For Cheshire, the summer of 2007 became a turning point. The town continued functioning. Schools remained open. Businesses continued serving customers. Families continued building their lives. But beneath the return to routine was an awareness that the community had experienced something that would always be part of its history. When people later looked back at Cheshire before the case, they often described the same qualities: quiet neighborhoods, familiar faces, and a strong sense of community. When they discussed Cheshire afterward, they spoke about resilience, remembrance, and the responsibility to learn from painful experiences. The physical town remained the same. The meaning attached to it changed. And that is one of the defining characteristics of places affected by tragedy. A location can hold multiple stories at once. It can be a place of ordinary childhood memories, family celebrations, and community traditions. It can also become associated with a difficult chapter that demands reflection. Both realities can exist together. Understanding the setting of this case is therefore not simply about describing a town in Connecticut. It is about understanding the environment in which people lived, the assumptions they carried about safety, and the human connections that existed before the investigation began. Because before there was a courtroom, there was a community. Before there were reports and evidence files, there were relationships. And before this became a nationally known case, it was a devastating interruption in the lives of real people who had simply been living an ordinary summer. A community is often defined by the things that happen every day. The morning routines. The familiar faces. The places people return to without thinking. Before Cheshire became connected with one of the most widely discussed criminal cases in Connecticut's history, it was known for much simpler things. It was a town where generations grew up, where families created memories, and where residents often measured time through ordinary milestones, school years, community events, holidays, and personal achievements. That sense of continuity was one of the strongest parts of Cheshire's identity. People who live in close communities often develop an invisible network of trust. They recognize the cars parked outside their neighbors' homes. They notice when a familiar face is missing from a local gathering. They build relationships not only through major events, but through thousands of small interactions that accumulate over years. This type of environment can create a powerful feeling of belonging. It can also create a difficult emotional challenge when that sense of security is disrupted. After the events of July 2007, Cheshire residents faced questions that extended beyond the immediate investigation. They were questions shared by communities around the world after unexpected tragedies occur. How does a community process something that feels impossible to understand? How do people continue daily life after a place they considered safe becomes associated with loss? And how can a community remember victims without allowing tragedy to become the only story told about them? These questions shaped much of the public conversation that followed. Media coverage naturally focused on the criminal investigation, court proceedings, and unanswered questions surrounding the events. However, within Cheshire itself, another process was taking place: the effort to preserve the memory of the people who had been lost and to support those who remained. This distinction matters because major criminal cases often create two separate narratives. One narrative belongs to the justice system. It focuses on evidence, responsibility, legal arguments, and verdicts. The other belongs to the community. It focuses on relationships, memories, grief, and healing. Both narratives exist at the same time. The legal system seeks answers through facts that can be examined and challenged. Communities seek meaning through remembrance and connection. Neither process can completely replace the other. In the years following the case, discussions about safety and emergency response became more prominent. Law enforcement agencies reviewed procedures and training approaches related to crisis situations. Officials examined communication methods, decision-making processes, and ways to improve responses during complex emergencies. These conversations reflected a broader reality of public safety. Every major incident becomes an opportunity for institutions to examine what worked, what failed, and what can be improved. For residents, however, the changes were also personal. A familiar neighborhood had become a place associated with national attention. Ordinary locations carried new meanings. Conversations that once centered on everyday life now sometimes included reflections on vulnerability, preparedness, and community responsibility. Yet communities are not defined only by their darkest moments. Over time, Cheshire continued to be a place where people lived, worked, studied, and built new memories. Children grew older. Families celebrated milestones. New residents arrived who knew the town through its present rather than through its painful history. This process does not erase what happened. Instead, it shows how communities carry difficult histories while continuing forward. The story of Cheshire is therefore not only a story about a criminal case. It is also a story about the complicated relationship between memory and recovery. A place can remember tragedy without being defined entirely by it. A community can acknowledge loss while still celebrating life. And the people affected by a tragedy can be remembered not only for what happened to them, but for who they were before that moment changed everything. Understanding this context is essential before examining the investigation that followed. The evidence, legal proceedings, and decisions made afterward did not occur in isolation. They unfolded within a community trying to find answers while also trying to preserve the ordinary humanity that existed before the headlines. Because behind every major case is a place. Behind every investigation are people. And behind every name mentioned in a courtroom record is a life that existed long before the world began paying attention. Before a name appears in a police report, a courtroom transcript, or a news headline, there is always a life behind it. There are years of memories. There are friendships formed slowly over time. There are small moments that never seem important at the time, yet later become the very things people hold on to when trying to remember someone. The story of the Petit family cannot begin with the tragedy that brought them into national attention. It must begin with who they were before that moment. A family. A husband and wife. 2 daughters growing into their own futures. A household filled with routines that looked ordinary from the outside, but carried the same meaning as any other family's daily life. William Petit was known in Cheshire not because he sought attention, but because his profession placed him in a position of service. As a physician, he spent his career caring for others during moments when they needed guidance and reassurance. Medicine is often described through science, diagnoses, treatments, procedures, and technology. But for many patients, the memory of a doctor is shaped by something less measurable. A conversation. A moment of patience. The feeling that someone was listening. Those qualities are often what create trust between a physician and the people who depend on them. Outside of his professional life, William Petit was also a husband and a father. Like many parents, much of his identity existed away from his career. The titles attached to his name, doctor, professional, community member, represented only parts of a larger life. At home, he was simply part of a family. Jennifer Hawke Petit was remembered by those who knew her as someone deeply connected to the lives around her. Her world was shaped by relationships, education, and family. She was involved in the experiences that define many parents' lives, supporting children, participating in community activities, and creating a sense of stability at home. The role of a parent is often made up of countless moments that go unnoticed. Preparing for another day. Helping with responsibilities. Encouraging children through challenges. Celebrating achievements that may seem small to outsiders but mean everything within a family. Those moments rarely become public stories. Yet they are often the most important ones. Jennifer's life, like the lives of many people remembered after tragedy, was not defined by the event that ended it. It was defined by the years that came before, the relationships she built, the people she supported, and the memories shared with those closest to her. The 2 youngest members of the family, Haley and Michaela, represented different stages of growing up. Haley was 17 years old, standing at a significant transition point between adolescence and adulthood. Like many young people her age, she was approaching decisions about the future, education, friendships, and the person she hoped to become. The final years of high school are often filled with change. Students begin imagining lives beyond familiar classrooms. They develop stronger identities. They form friendships that can last decades. They begin moving toward independence while still remaining connected to family. Haley's life was part of that journey. She was not simply a name associated with a tragic event. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend, and a young person with a future that was still unfolding. Michaela, at 11 years old, was experiencing a different chapter of life. Childhood is a period defined by discovery. It is a time when ordinary experiences can feel enormous, learning something new, enjoying friendships, exploring interests, and imagining possibilities. At that age, the world is still full of questions. Children see the future as something wide open. They are still discovering who they are and what they might become. For families, watching children grow is one of life's most meaningful experiences. Parents often remember small details that others might overlook, a favorite activity, a unique personality trait, a habit that made them smile. Those details are what remain when people speak about loved ones after loss. Not statistics. Not headlines. Not legal documents. The human details. One of the challenges of discussing victims in high-profile criminal cases is that public attention often arrives only after something terrible has happened. The world learns names through tragedy rather than through life. That can unintentionally create an incomplete picture. The Petit family's story is not only about the circumstances that brought them into public awareness. It is also about the years before. The celebrations. The conversations. The everyday moments that formed a family's history. When communities remember victims, they often return to those details because they represent something important. A person's life is always larger than the moment that changed how others know their name. This idea became especially significant in the aftermath of the Cheshire case. Friends, neighbors, and community members worked to preserve memories that existed before the investigation began. They spoke about personalities, relationships, and contributions rather than allowing the victims to become only symbols of a crime. That process of remembrance is part of how communities respond to loss. They collect stories. They share memories. They remind one another that behind every case file is a human being. The impact of the tragedy was felt not only by the immediate family, but by everyone who had known them in different ways. Friends lost people they cared about. Neighbors lost familiar faces. The wider community lost individuals who had been part of its everyday fabric. Grief often reveals how connected people truly are. A person's influence may extend much further than they realize while they are alive. A teacher may remember a student. A colleague may remember a conversation. A neighbor may remember a simple kindness. These memories form a larger portrait. And that portrait matters. Because understanding the victims is essential to understanding the full story. A criminal case can tell us what happened. A person's life tells us why it mattered. The Petit family entered public memory because of a devastating event, but they belonged to a much larger story, one of family, community, and the ordinary experiences that make a life meaningful. Before investigators arrived. Before courtrooms became the center of attention. Before the country learned the name Cheshire. There was simply a family living their lives. And that is where their story deserves to begin. The way people are remembered is often shaped by the moments they shared with others. A photograph can capture a smile, but it cannot capture the conversations that happened before it was taken. A biography can list achievements, but it cannot fully describe the quiet gestures that made someone meaningful to the people around them. For the Petit family, remembrance has always depended on those details. The details that existed before the tragedy. The details that belonged to everyday life. In many families, the most important memories are not necessarily the dramatic ones. They are the ordinary moments repeated so often that people rarely stop to recognize their value. A conversation after a long day. A meal shared around a table. A family tradition carried from one year to the next. A familiar voice calling from another room. These are the pieces of life that create a sense of home. For William and Jennifer Petit, their home was not simply a physical location. It was the place where their family history unfolded. It held years of experiences, celebrations, challenges, and milestones. Like many parents, they watched their children grow through different stages of life. They experienced the constant changes that come with raising a family, the transition from childhood curiosity to teenage independence, the shifting responsibilities of parenting, and the hope that their children would one day build lives of their own. Those hopes are shared by parents everywhere. A child's future represents possibility. It represents all the moments that have not happened yet. Graduations. Careers. Relationships. Personal discoveries. The small decisions and experiences that eventually shape an adult life. For Haley, that future was approaching quickly. At 17, she was at an age when many young people begin looking beyond their hometowns and imagining what comes next. The final years of adolescence often carry a unique mixture of confidence and uncertainty. Young people begin defining their own identities while still relying on the support systems that shaped them. Family remains an important foundation during that transition. Parents provide guidance. Friends provide connection. Communities provide a sense of belonging. For Michaela, Childhood still carried the excitement of discovery. At 11 years old, she was in a period where everyday experiences could become memorable. Children at that age are constantly learning about themselves and the world around them. Their interests change quickly. Their personalities continue developing. Their imagination creates possibilities that adults sometimes forget. When communities remember children lost too soon, they often focus on what they represented: potential. The future they might have experienced. The person they might have become. That sense of unfinished possibility is one of the most painful aspects of any tragedy involving young lives. It is not only the loss of the present. It is the loss of countless imagined futures. The Petty family story also highlights something important about the way society discusses victims of crime. Public attention often arrives suddenly and intensely. A person who lived privately may become known by millions of strangers within days. But public recognition is not the same as understanding. Understanding requires looking beyond the event. It requires seeing the complete person. For Jennifer, that meant remembering her roles as a mother, wife, friend, and community member. For William, it meant recognizing a life dedicated both to his family and to caring for others through his medical profession. For Haley and Michaela, it meant remembering two young people who were still becoming themselves. This effort to preserve identity after tragedy is common in communities around the world. Families and friends often feel a responsibility to protect memories from being overshadowed by the circumstances of loss. They tell stories. They collect photographs. They share experiences. They remind others that a person's life cannot be reduced to a single event. The same principle applies when examining any major criminal case. Investigations focus on facts. Courts focus on evidence. Public discussions often focus on unanswered questions. All of those elements are necessary. But they represent only one part of the story. The other part belongs to the people whose lives existed before the investigation began. This distinction became especially important in Cheshire because the case attracted national attention. News coverage brought cameras and reporters into a community that had previously lived outside the spotlight. The victims' names became familiar across the country. With that attention came a responsibility. To remember carefully. To avoid allowing a tragedy to erase the lives that came before it. To recognize that victims are not defined by what happened to them. They are defined by everything they gave to others while they were here. Over time, memorial efforts and community initiatives helped preserve the memory of the Petty family. These efforts reflected a common human response to loss, transforming grief into something that supports others. Many families affected by tragedy choose this path. They create foundations. They support causes. They share lessons. Not because those actions replace what was lost, but because they allow memories to continue influencing the world. The legacy of a person is often carried through the people they touched. A kindness remembered by a friend. A lesson remembered by a student. A moment of compassion remembered by someone who needed it. Those memories become a form of continuation. When looking back at the Cheshire case, it is easy to focus entirely on the investigation and the legal proceedings that followed. Those elements are part of the historical record. But before the investigation, there was a family story. A story of parents raising children. A story of individuals contributing to their community. A story of lives that were meaningful long before they became part of a national conversation. Remembering that context changes the way the case is understood. It shifts the focus from only what was lost to also what existed. Because every victim has a history. Every name has a story. And every story deserves to begin with who someone was, not only with what happened to them. As the years passed, people who knew the Petty family often found themselves returning to the same conclusion: it was the ordinary moments they missed the most. Grief rarely lives only in milestones. It appears in routines. An empty chair at a family gathering. A birthday remembered without a familiar phone call. A holiday tradition that suddenly feels incomplete. The absence of someone is often measured not by extraordinary events, but by the countless ordinary moments that no longer unfold in the same way. For friends and neighbors in Cheshire, remembering the Petit family meant remembering those ordinary moments. They remembered conversations at community events, familiar greetings, and the quiet rhythm of lives that had been woven into the fabric of the town for years. Those memories became an important counterbalance to the national attention focused on the criminal case itself. Communities often respond to tragedy by trying to preserve identity. That effort is not about denying what happened. It is about refusing to let a single event become the only story that survives. In the months that followed the case, expressions of support came from well beyond Connecticut. Letters arrived from people who had never met the family but had been moved by their story. Memorial services brought together neighbors, friends, colleagues, and strangers united by a shared sense of loss. The response reflected something larger than one town. It demonstrated how deeply people can empathize with lives they know only through fragments of information. For William Petit, the years that followed would bring challenges no one could have anticipated. Recovering from profound personal loss is not something that follows a predictable path. There is no timetable for grief, no single moment when life simply returns to what it once was. Yet over time, he chose to speak publicly about remembrance, resilience, and the importance of honoring the lives of Jennifer, Haley, and Michaela through constructive work. Rather than allowing their memory to exist only within the context of a criminal case, efforts were made to support charitable causes and community initiatives that reflected values important to the family. That choice illustrates a pattern seen in many communities affected by tragedy. Some people respond by turning inward. Others respond by trying to help those around them. Neither response is right or wrong. Each represents a different way of carrying memory forward. The legacy of a life cannot be measured only by its length. It is also reflected in the influence that continues after a person is gone. For Jennifer, that legacy lived on in the people who remembered her kindness and commitment to family. For Haley and Michaela, it lived on in the memories shared by friends, classmates, teachers, and relatives who continued to speak of them as individuals with their own personalities, interests, and dreams. Those memories matter because they restore perspective. Criminal investigations are necessarily focused on evidence. Court proceedings concentrate on facts that can be proven. Historical records summarize events in chronological order. But memory works differently. Memory preserves laughter. It remembers encouragement. It recalls the ordinary moments that official documents cannot capture. That is why it is important, before examining the events that unfolded in July 2007, to pause and recognize the people at the center of the story as more than participants in a legal case. They were members of a family whose lives extended far beyond the circumstances that eventually brought them into public attention. Only after understanding who they were can the events that followed be viewed in their proper context. The next chapter of this story does not begin with investigators or courtroom testimony. It begins with a summer evening that, like so many others, appeared completely ordinary. Nothing in the quiet streets suggested that within hours, a sequence of decisions would unfold that would change not only one family, but an entire community. The routines of the day gradually gave way to the stillness of night. Neighbors finished evening conversations and returned indoors. Lights slowly disappeared from windows as households settled into familiar patterns. For most residents of Cheshire, the night promised nothing unusual. It was simply the end of another summer day. History, however, often arrives without announcing itself. The people living through those final ordinary hours had no way of knowing that investigators would later reconstruct the coming events minute by minute, that news organizations across the nation would report from their streets, or that the town's name would become permanently associated with one of the most widely discussed criminal cases in Connecticut's history. At that moment, there was only the quiet certainty that tomorrow would resemble today. It is that certainty, shared by families everywhere, that makes what followed so deeply affecting. Because every community has evenings that feel ordinary. Every family has routines they assume will continue. And every life is lived forward without the knowledge of how history will one day look back. That quiet summer night marked the final chapter of ordinary life before an extraordinary investigation began. The morning of July 23, 2007, began like many other summer mornings in Cheshire. For most residents, it was simply another day beginning in a familiar community. People followed their usual routines. Some prepared for work. Others planned errands, appointments, and ordinary responsibilities that fill the rhythm of everyday life. But inside one home on a quiet residential street, events were unfolding that would soon bring national attention to a town that had rarely appeared in headlines. The Cheshire home invasion would later become one of the most closely examined criminal cases in Connecticut history. Yet before investigators, prosecutors, and legal experts began analyzing the evidence, there was first a period of uncertainty, an unfolding emergency in which authorities had only fragments of information. In situations involving possible hostages, time becomes a complicated factor. Every moment matters. Every decision carries consequences. And every piece of information must be evaluated carefully. The first challenge for responding officers was understanding what was happening inside the residence. Early information in emergency situations is often incomplete. Dispatchers, officers, and supervisors must make decisions based on what they know at that moment, not what will become clear later through investigation. That distinction became central to the public discussion surrounding the Cheshire case. After receiving information connected to the situation, law enforcement officers moved toward the area and began establishing a response. The priority in such circumstances is typically to protect potential victims, contain possible threats, gather intelligence, and determine the safest course of action. The scene that officers encountered was not a simple criminal investigation. It was a crisis. A crisis involving uncertainty, possible danger, and the responsibility of making decisions that could affect multiple lives. As the response developed, law enforcement officials faced questions that would later be examined extensively. What information was available? What risks were understood? What options were considered? How should authorities respond when the immediate situation inside a location cannot be fully confirmed? These questions are not unique to one case. Across the world, emergency responders face similar challenges during complex incidents. The difference between a successful resolution and a tragic outcome can depend on information, timing, communication, and rapidly changing circumstances. In the aftermath of the Cheshire incident, these issues became part of a broader conversation about emergency response procedures. Officials reviewed the actions taken. Experts examined the decisions made. The public debated whether different choices could have changed the outcome. Such discussions are difficult because they involve the uncomfortable reality that people making decisions during emergencies rarely have complete knowledge. They must act while events are still developing. The investigation that followed would eventually provide a much clearer picture of what had occurred inside the home. Evidence collected afterward would allow authorities to reconstruct a timeline and establish responsibility through the legal process. But during the emergency itself, responders were operating within uncertainty. That uncertainty became one of the defining themes of the case. For the Cheshire community, the hours that followed transformed a familiar neighborhood into the center of national attention. Roads that residents had traveled countless times became associated with police activity and media coverage. A private family tragedy became a public event observed by millions. Yet behind the public discussion was a more personal reality. A family had been affected. A community was grieving. And investigators were beginning the difficult process of understanding what had happened. Major criminal cases often create a tension between public curiosity and human loss. The public wants answers quickly. Investigators must build those answers carefully. Families must process events that cannot simply be summarized through headlines. The Cheshire case would continue through months and years of investigation, legal proceedings, and review. But on that morning, before courtrooms and evidence presentations, there was only an emergency response unfolding in real time. A community waiting for answers. Authorities trying to understand the situation. And a family whose lives had been permanently changed. The incident would eventually become a case studied by law enforcement professionals, discussed by legal experts, and remembered by residents of Cheshire. But at its center remained a simple truth. Behind every emergency response is not only a procedure or a strategy. There are people. People whose lives are affected by decisions made in moments of uncertainty. People whose stories continue long after the sirens disappeared. In the hours after the emergency response began, the focus shifted from uncertainty toward understanding. For investigators, the first priority was not simply determining what had happened, but creating a reliable picture of events from available evidence. In complex criminal cases, the truth is rarely revealed through one single discovery. Instead, it emerges gradually through the careful combination of information, witness accounts, physical evidence, communications records, and the reconstruction of a timeline. The Cheshire case would become an example of how difficult that process can be. Early reports rarely contain the full story. Emergency situations develop quickly, and the information available at the beginning is often incomplete. Responders must make decisions while facts are still changing. Later, investigators may have access to additional evidence that was unavailable during those first critical moments. This difference between real-time decision-making and later analysis became one of the central issues surrounding the case. After the immediate crisis ended, attention turned toward preserving evidence and establishing what had occurred. Investigators worked to document the scene, collect relevant materials, and build a timeline that could withstand examination in court. Modern criminal investigations depend on detail. A small piece of evidence can confirm or challenge a statement. A recorded communication can establish timing. A witness memory can provide context. A forensic result can connect individuals to specific events. But evidence alone does not tell a story automatically. Investigators must interpret it carefully. They must consider alternative explanations, compare statements, and determine which conclusions are supported by facts rather than assumptions. This process can take weeks, months, or even years in major cases. As the investigation progressed, authorities focused on identifying the individuals responsible and understanding how the events developed. The backgrounds, actions, and decisions of the suspects became subjects of intense examination. Public attention quickly expanded beyond Connecticut. News organizations across the country followed developments closely. The case raised questions about criminal behavior, emergency response, and the challenges faced by law enforcement during situations involving possible hostages. For many viewers watching from outside the state, the case became a reminder that serious crimes can affect communities that appear peaceful and secure. For residents of Cheshire, however, the experience was much more personal. They were not observing a story from a distance. They were living through the aftermath. Neighbors faced the reality that a familiar street had become associated with a devastating event. Community members struggled with grief while also trying to support one another and return to daily routines. The return to normal life after tragedy is never simple. A town may reopen schools, resume business, and continue community activities, but emotional recovery follows a different timeline. People carry memories, questions, and uncertainty long after the public attention fades. The case also introduced difficult conversations about emergency response. Law enforcement agencies routinely review major incidents to understand what can be improved. These reviews are not only about assigning responsibility, they are also about learning. What information was available? How was that information communicated? Were procedures followed effectively? What lessons could help responders in future situations? These questions are part of how public safety systems evolve. Every major emergency provides an opportunity for examination because the goal of response planning is not only to address past events, but to improve future outcomes. The Cheshire case became part of that broader discussion. Officials, legal experts, and members of the public debated the balance between caution and immediate action during uncertain situations. Some argued that different choices might have produced a different result. Others emphasized the complexity of decisions made without complete information. The debate continued because the questions were difficult. There were no simple answers. Behind every policy discussion were real people and real consequences. That reality is what made the case so significant. It was not only a criminal investigation. It was also an examination of how institutions respond when faced with circumstances that challenge even experienced professionals. As authorities continued gathering evidence, the case moved from an active emergency into a formal investigation. The focus shifted toward accountability, legal responsibility, and preparing for what would eventually become a highly publicized court process. But before the courtroom arguments began, before attorneys presented competing versions of events, and before judges and juries examined the evidence, investigators faced the enormous task of transforming chaos into a clear record. That process required patience. It required accuracy. And above all, it required remembering the human impact behind every piece of evidence collected. Because criminal investigations are ultimately about more than solving a case. They are about understanding what happened, establishing responsibility, and seeking justice for those whose lives were changed forever. As the immediate emergency gave way to a formal investigation, the nature of the case began to change. The first hours of any major investigation are filled with uncertainty. Investigators are not simply searching for answers, they are trying to determine which questions matter most. Every piece of information must be evaluated. Every statement must be compared. Every assumption must be tested against evidence. In Cheshire, the investigation required authorities to reconstruct events that had taken place inside a private residence, away from public view. The challenge was to transform a confusing and traumatic situation into a clear, factual timeline. That process began with preservation. Investigators documented the scene carefully, recognizing that even small details could become significant later. Modern criminal investigations depend on the ability to connect separate pieces of information into a larger picture. A single piece of evidence may appear limited on its own. A statement from one person may raise questions rather than answer them. A timeline may seem incomplete until another source confirms a missing detail. The work of investigators is often a process of gradually reducing uncertainty. The case also required examining the backgrounds and histories of the individuals accused of responsibility. Understanding a suspect's past does not determine guilt by itself, but it can provide context for investigators as they examine patterns of behavior, previous interactions with the legal system, and possible motives. As authorities gathered information, two names became central to the investigation: Stephen Hayes and Joshua Komisarjevsky. Both men had previous criminal histories and struggled with issues that had placed them in contact with the justice system before the Cheshire case. Investigators examined their backgrounds, their movements, and their connections to the events under investigation. The relationship between the two suspects would later become an important element of the legal proceedings. During the investigation and subsequent trials, questions emerged about individual responsibility, decision-making, and the role each person played. As is common in serious criminal cases involving multiple defendants, legal arguments focused not only on whether crimes occurred, but also on how responsibility should be assigned. Those questions would eventually be decided through the court system. Before that stage, however, investigators continued building their case. Forensic evidence became a significant part of the investigation. Scientific analysis has become one of the most important tools in modern law enforcement because it allows investigators to establish connections based on measurable facts rather than only statements or assumptions. DNA analysis, fingerprints, digital records, physical evidence, and witness information can each contribute to a broader understanding of events. However, evidence does not exist in isolation. Investigators must determine how pieces relate to one another and whether they create a consistent explanation. This process requires both technical skill and careful judgment. The public often imagines investigations as moments of sudden discovery, a single clue that immediately reveals the truth. In reality, many investigations develop slowly. They are built through hundreds of small steps. A conversation. A document. A laboratory result. A detail that seemed insignificant at first but later becomes important. The Cheshire investigation followed this pattern. As more information became available, the case moved from uncertainty toward a clearer understanding of what had occurred. prosecutors began preparing for a legal process that would require them to present evidence in a way that met the highest standards of the justice system. That responsibility is central to criminal trials. The goal is not simply to tell a compelling story. The goal is to prove facts through evidence and legal procedure. For the victim's family, friends, and the wider community, the investigation represented a search for accountability. But it was also a reminder that legal justice follows its own timeline. Investigations must be thorough. Evidence must be reviewed. Defendants have legal rights that must be respected. This process can feel slow, especially in cases involving enormous public attention and emotional consequences. Yet the careful nature of the justice system exists for an important reason. The consequences of criminal convictions are among the most serious decisions a society can make. By the time the case moved toward trial, the story had already changed from a local tragedy into a national legal event. Reporters followed developments closely. Experts analyzed the investigation. The public debated the details and the questions raised by the case. But inside the courtroom, the focus would become narrower. Evidence. Testimony. Legal arguments. Responsibility. The emotional weight of the case remained undeniable, but the judicial process required discipline. A courtroom cannot operate on emotion alone. It must rely on facts that can be examined, challenged, and evaluated. That transition from a community trying to understand a tragedy to a legal system determining accountability marked the next chapter of the Cheshire case. The investigation had begun with uncertainty. It continued through evidence. And it would eventually move toward the moment when the facts gathered by investigators would be presented before a judge and jury. The moments after a major crime are often defined by questions. What happened? Who was responsible? How can investigators separate facts from assumptions? For the authorities assigned to the Cheshire case, answering those questions required a careful and methodical process. The investigation was not built around one dramatic discovery. Instead, it developed through the collection, comparison, and interpretation of many different pieces of information. A crime scene is more than a location. It is a record of events. Every investigation begins with the responsibility of preserving that record as accurately as possible. Investigators must document conditions, collect potential evidence, and create a reliable foundation for everything that follows. In complex cases, the first challenge is often understanding the sequence of events. A timeline becomes one of the most important tools available to investigators. By establishing when actions occurred, authorities can compare witness accounts, examine physical evidence, and determine whether different pieces of information support the same conclusion. The Cheshire investigation required this type of reconstruction. Investigators examined multiple sources of information, including physical evidence, interviews, records, and forensic analysis. Each element provided another part of the larger picture. Some evidence answered questions. Other evidence created new ones. That is the nature of criminal investigations. The process is rarely a straight line from discovery to conclusion. It is a gradual movement from uncertainty toward a clearer understanding. Forensic science played an important role in the investigation. Modern forensic methods allow investigators to analyze evidence in ways that were once impossible. Scientific testing can help establish connections, confirm statements, and provide information that may not be available through traditional investigative methods. However, forensic evidence is only one part of the process. Science can provide important findings, but investigators must still understand the context surrounding those findings. Evidence must be interpreted within the larger timeline of events. This requires cooperation between different areas of expertise. Detectives gather information. Forensic specialists analyze materials. Prosecutors review legal implications. Experts help explain technical findings. Together, these efforts create the foundation for a criminal case. As investigators worked to understand the events in Cheshire, public attention continued to grow. Many people following the case wanted immediate answers, but investigations of this scale require time. Accuracy matters because the conclusions reached will affect not only the accused, but also victims' families, communities, and public confidence in the justice system. The pressure surrounding high-profile cases can be intense. Media attention increases. Public opinions form quickly. Rumors can spread before facts are established. For investigators, the challenge is maintaining focus on evidence rather than speculation. The discovery phase of an investigation is also where the experiences of victims and survivors become central. While legal proceedings focus on proving crimes and establishing responsibility, investigators are also working to understand the impact on real people. Behind every piece of evidence is a human story. Behind every report is a family seeking answers. Behind every legal decision are consequences that extend far beyond the courtroom. This reality shaped the way the Cheshire case was viewed by both officials and the public. The investigation was not simply an effort to solve a criminal case. It was an effort to create a factual record of what happened and provide a path toward accountability. As the evidence began forming a clearer picture, attention shifted toward the individuals connected to the investigation. Authorities examined the backgrounds, actions, and relationships of those involved. The case moved from a question of what happened toward the question of who would be held responsible. That transition is a critical moment in any criminal investigation. Finding evidence is only the beginning. The justice system must then determine how that evidence should be evaluated, challenged, and presented. The work done during the discovery phase would eventually become the foundation of the courtroom proceedings that followed. Every interview, every forensic examination, every documented detail, each contributed to the process of transforming a traumatic event into an organized legal case. And as the investigation continued, the search for answers moved closer to the individuals at the center of the case, setting the stage for the next phase, identifying suspects, examining their histories, and understanding how investigators connected them to the crime. As investigators continued examining the evidence connected to the Cheshire case, the focus gradually moved from understanding the event itself to identifying the individuals responsible. This stage of an investigation is often where separate pieces of information begin to connect. A name mentioned in an interview. A record that confirms a timeline. A physical item that links one location to another. Individually, these details may appear limited. Together, they can create a much clearer picture. Investigators are trained to look for those connections. They compare statements. They verify movements. They examine relationships between people, locations, and events. The goal is not simply to create a theory. The goal is to develop a conclusion supported by evidence. In the Cheshire investigation, authorities examined the backgrounds of Stephen Hayes and Joshua Komisarjevsky, including their previous encounters with the criminal justice system. Their histories became part of the broader investigation as authorities attempted to understand the circumstances surrounding the crime. However, investigators and prosecutors must separate background information from proof. A person's past may provide context, but criminal responsibility must be established through evidence related to the specific case being investigated. That distinction is one of the foundations of the justice system. The investigation also revealed the importance of cooperation between different agencies and specialists. Complex cases often require many forms of expertise working together. Detectives organize information. Forensic specialists analyze evidence. Prosecutors evaluate how evidence can be presented legally. Experts interpret technical findings. Each role contributes to building a complete understanding of events. As the case developed, the two suspects became the central figures in the investigation. Their actions, statements, and relationship with one another would later become major elements of the court proceedings. Multiple defendant cases often involve complicated legal questions. Who was responsible for which actions? How should individual involvement be evaluated? What evidence demonstrates each person's role? These questions would eventually be debated in court. Before that happened, investigators continued preparing the foundation of the case. The public often sees the moment when suspects are identified as the conclusion of an investigation. In reality, it is usually another beginning. Once investigators have identified possible suspects, they must still build a case that can withstand legal examination. Every claim must be supported. Every piece of evidence must follow proper procedures. Every conclusion must be tested. This process can be demanding, especially in cases receiving intense public attention. The pressure for quick answers can be enormous. Communities want reassurance. Families want justice. The public wants accountability. But the justice system depends on careful preparation because the consequences are permanent. The Cheshire case would eventually move from investigation into prosecution, where evidence gathered over months would be presented in court. Before that stage, investigators continued examining every available detail, creating a record that would allow judges and juries to evaluate the facts. The transition from investigation to trial represents one of the most important moments in any criminal case. The work of investigators is focused on discovering what happened. The work of the court is focused on determining legal responsibility. Those are connected processes, but they are not the same. By the time prosecutors began preparing their cases, the investigation had transformed an overwhelming tragedy into a structured collection of evidence and testimony. The uncertainty that existed in the early hours had gradually been replaced by a clearer understanding of events. But many questions remained. The courtroom would become the place where those questions were examined publicly. There, prosecutors and defense attorneys would present competing arguments. Witnesses would provide testimony. Evidence collected during the investigation would be reviewed. And a jury would ultimately decide the legal outcome. Before that could happen, however, investigators still had one crucial task ahead: connecting the evidence into a complete narrative of responsibility. As the investigation progressed, the focus moved from collecting information to organizing the truth into a form that could be examined through the legal system. A criminal investigation does not end when investigators believe they understand what happened. The next challenge is proving those conclusions through evidence that can withstand scrutiny. Every detail must be reviewed. Every timeline must be tested. Every statement must be compared with available facts. This process is often invisible to the public. While headlines may focus on major developments, investigators continue working through countless details behind the scenes. Reports are written. Evidence is catalogued. Interviews are reviewed. Specialists examine findings and prepare explanations that can later be presented in court. The Cheshire case required this level of preparation because of its complexity and the seriousness of the charges involved. Investigators were not only attempting to determine what occurred inside the home. They were also working to establish the roles and responsibilities of the individuals accused. In cases involving multiple suspects, responsibility is often one of the most important legal questions. The court must consider individual actions, available evidence, and the arguments presented by both the prosecution and the defense. This is where the investigation and the justice system meet. Investigators gather facts. Courts evaluate those facts. The distinction is essential because a criminal conviction requires more than public belief or emotional response. It requires evidence that meets legal standards. As prosecutors prepared their cases, they reviewed the material gathered during the investigation and determined how that information could be presented to a jury. A successful prosecution depends not only on having evidence, but also on explaining how different pieces of evidence connect. A courtroom does not see an investigation unfold in real time. Instead, attorneys must reconstruct events through testimony, documents, and exhibits. They must guide judges and jurors through a sequence of events that may have taken investigators months to understand. For the victim's family and the Cheshire community, the movement toward trial represented another significant stage in a long process. The investigation had answered some questions. The court would now address questions of legal responsibility. But legal proceedings cannot erase the emotional impact of a tragedy. A verdict can establish accountability. It cannot restore lives interrupted. This reality is present in many major criminal cases. The justice system operates through procedures, rules, and evidence. Grief operates differently. Families and communities continue carrying memories regardless of what happens inside a courtroom. The Cheshire case also remained a subject of discussion beyond the criminal proceedings. Questions about emergency response, public safety, and institutional decision-making continued to receive attention. Major cases often lead to broader examination because they reveal challenges that extend beyond one specific incident. How should authorities respond during uncertain emergencies? How can communication improve during rapidly developing situations? How can communities prepare while preserving a sense of trust and security? These questions became part of the wider legacy of the case. By the time the investigation reached its later stages, what had begun as an unfolding crisis had become a carefully documented legal matter. Evidence had been collected. Suspects had been identified. Prosecutors and defense attorneys prepared their arguments. The next chapter would move from investigation to courtroom. There, the facts gathered over months would be examined publicly. Witnesses would speak. Evidence would be presented. Arguments would be challenged. And the justice system would begin the process of determining the final legal consequences. The investigation had been a search for answers. The trial would become a search for justice. Min tip tuc theo hung phim tai liu diu tra, tap trung vau qua trin diu tra, fan tich chung cuvacac quiet din faplai, tai six tai hien vuan theo hung jiat gan. The investigation. Every major criminal investigation begins with uncertainty. At the beginning, investigators rarely have a complete picture. They have fragments, information from emergency calls, observations from the first responders, statements from witnesses, and evidence that must be carefully interpreted. The challenge is transforming those fragments into a reliable account of what happened. The Cheshire investigation followed that difficult path. Once the immediate emergency had ended, law enforcement agencies moved into a different phase of work. The focus was no longer only on responding to a crisis. It became the task of understanding events, identifying responsibility, and building a case that could be examined through the justice system. Investigations of this scale require patience. They require investigators to avoid assumptions and follow evidence wherever it leads. A single theory may seem convincing at first, but investigators must continue testing it. They must ask whether the evidence supports the conclusion, whether alternative explanations exist, and whether every important detail has been properly examined. This careful process is what separates an investigation from speculation. In the Cheshire case, authorities examined multiple areas of evidence. Physical evidence, witness information, records, and forensic analysis all contributed to the larger picture. No single piece of evidence told the entire story. Instead, investigators built connections between many separate elements. This is often how complex cases are solved. A timeline becomes clearer. Relationships between individuals become better understood. Questions that seemed impossible at the beginning begin to receive answers. As investigators worked, attention turned toward Stephen Hayes and Joshua Komisarjevsky. Their backgrounds, actions, and connections to the case became central areas of examination. Both men had previous involvement with the criminal justice system, and investigators considered how their histories related to the current investigation. However, criminal cases cannot be decided solely by a person's past. Previous behavior may provide context, but legal responsibility must be established through evidence connected to the specific allegations being investigated. That principle became especially important as the case moved forward. The investigation also required careful examination of the relationship between the two defendants. When multiple individuals are accused in the same case, determining each person's role can become a complicated legal issue. Prosecutors must present evidence showing responsibility. Defense attorneys must challenge that evidence and raise questions about the prosecution's claims. Ultimately, a court must evaluate the facts. This process reflects one of the central principles of the justice system: serious accusations require serious proof. As the investigation continued, Authorities worked to organize thousands of details into a coherent case. Reports were prepared. Evidence was reviewed. Specialists analyzed technical information. Prosecutors began evaluating how the investigation's findings could be presented in court. For the public, these developments often appeared as major moments: arrests, announcements, and legal filings. Behind those moments, however, was a much slower process. Investigators reviewing documents, experts conducting analysis, officials verifying information. The work of solving a complex case often happens quietly. It is a process built on persistence rather than dramatic discoveries. The investigation also took place under intense public attention. Because of the severity of the case and the impact on the Cheshire community, people across the country followed developments closely. That attention created additional challenges. Investigators had to work while public speculation continued. Officials had to communicate information without compromising the legal process. Families affected by the tragedy had to navigate grief while the investigation unfolded in public view. High-profile cases often place many different pressures on the people involved. Law enforcement seeks answers. Families seek justice. The public seeks understanding. The legal system requires fairness. Balancing those needs is one of the most difficult aspects of major criminal investigations. As evidence accumulated, the case moved closer toward prosecution. The uncertainty of the early investigation gradually gave way to a clearer understanding of the events and the individuals accused. But identifying suspects was only one stage. The next challenge would be proving the case in court. The investigation had created the foundation. The courtroom would determine what that foundation meant under the law.